The night was deceptively quiet, the kind that invites reflection. The occasional rumble of a passing car disturbed the stillness, but for the most part, the world seemed to rest in a quiet lull. Streetlights cast long, stretching shadows along the suburban roads of Charlotte, North Carolina, turning every corner into a muted silhouette. As the black SUV glided down Preston Avenue, it blended so seamlessly with the night, it might have been a mere shadow itself. Inside, a man in his late 40s drove with the kind of ease that comes from countless familiar commutes. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, and his gaze flicked to the dashboard, where the soft glow illuminated his features in a quiet dance. This route home was nothing new, just another winding drive after a long day. But tonight, something in the air was different. It was a feeling that lingered, as if the world itself held its breath. Then, out of nowhere, a patrol car surged into his rearview mirror, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The vehicle grew closer, the flashing blue and red lights filling the night with urgency, and soon the sharp wail of the siren broke the silence. The man's response was calm, a simple sigh as he flicked his blinker and guided the SUV to the shoulder, parking with the smooth precision of someone who'd been through this routine before. Officer Whitman, adjusting his belt as he exited the patrol car, was a man of habits. He had been on this beat for months, taking pride in his sharp observations. But tonight, his usual vigilance was laced with something else, an assumption, a gut feeling that took hold the moment he spotted the SUV. He knew, or thought he knew, what kind of driver he was dealing with. As he approached, the light from his flashlight darted over the tinted windows, illuminating the man behind the wheel. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a face, calm and composed, bathed in the beam of the flashlight. "Good evening, officer," the man's voice was steady, almost disarmingly so. Whitman leaned in, his voice brisk. "License and registration." The routine request, the first words of many encounters like this, but tonight something felt different. His tone sharpened with the kind of certainty only familiarity could breed. The man, calm as ever, reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and slow. He handed over his license with the quiet assurance of someone who had done this more times than he cared to count. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Whitman's voice was suddenly sharper, probing for a confession. "No, officer, I'm not sure." The man's response was simple, the words measured but not evasive. He met Whitman's gaze with a steady calm, as if this encounter were just another moment in his routine. Whitman, undeterred, crossed his arms, the beam of his flashlight now resting on the dashboard. "You rolled through a stop sign back there. That's dangerous, especially around here." He shifted his weight, his posture changing subtly. "What's your reason for being out so late?" "I'm just heading home," the man replied, his voice neutral, unruffled. It was a calm, even response, and for a moment, the tension hung in the air like a question unsaid. Anthony's years of experience told him this wasn't the moment to push back. He had learned when to defuse and when to stand his ground. Tonight was neither a fight nor a flight, just a quiet endurance. Whitman's eyes narrowed, and there was a flicker of something behind them, a hesitation, maybe, or a judgment forming. His next words dripped with a casual mockery. "This is a nice vehicle," he said, tapping the roof of the SUV. "Is it yours?" Anthony raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained unreadable. "Yes, officer. It's registered under my name. You can check if you like." Whitman didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tapped the flashlight against the roof and nodded toward the glove compartment. "Let's see the registration," he said, his voice now tinged with something more probing. Anthony leaned over, slow and deliberate, retrieving the papers. Whitman's hand hovered near his holster as if ready for something that wasn't there. A silent signal passed between them, an unspoken understanding of the dance they were engaged in. When the registration was handed over, Whitman's eyes flicked over it with exaggerated care. "Everything checks out," he muttered, but there was something in his tone that suggested otherwise. "Where exactly are you coming from tonight?" he asked, his voice casual but the weight behind it was palpable. "Work," Anthony replied succinctly, keeping his tone neutral, not offering more than what was needed. "Work, huh?" Whitman's voice had a hint of disbelief, as if the word itself tasted wrong. "What do you do?" For a split second, Anthony considered offering a fuller explanation. He weighed the moment, choosing instead to say, "I'm in law enforcement." His words were deliberate, leaving just enough room for doubt. Whitman froze for a beat, the flashlight faltering in his hand, and for a moment, the tension was almost suffocating. Oh really? Whitman's voice hardened, a sneer creeping into his tone. Where exactly do you serve? I'm downtown, Anthony answered flatly, his calm unwavering. Been with the department for over 20 years. His words were crisp, a sharp declaration, but they did little to shift the suspicion in Whitman's posture. Whitman didn't respond right away. His body stiffened, and his gaze grew more intense, as though he were seeing something beneath the surface of the man in front of him that just wasn't adding up. Let's see about that, Whitman muttered, stepping back toward his patrol car. There was no respect in his voice, only disbelief, and maybe a hint of something darker, a question about who this man really was. As Whitman disappeared into the shadows, Anthony leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. The officer's reaction was nothing new, but tonight, it felt different, more confrontational, more charged. Through the rearview mirror, he watched as Whitman lingered by his patrol car, the officer's body language animated, his hands gesturing as he seemed to speak into his radio with a kind of frenzy, as if searching for something he couldn't find. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the dashboard, a rhythmic pulse in the otherwise still night. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity, until finally, Whitman returned, his expression unreadable, his body taut with tension. The officer leaned down, his flashlight aimed just off-center, barely grazing Anthony's face. Mr. Dean, Whitman began, emphasizing the name as though it were foreign to him. Your records check out, but I need you to step out of the vehicle. Anthony frowned, his calm never wavering. May I ask why, officer? I've already provided all the required documentation. Whitman's lips tightened into a thin line, his hand hovering near his belt. Step out of the car, he repeated, his voice more forceful now. Anthony knew what was coming. He'd been here before. Pushing back wouldn't change anything. With slow deliberation, he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. His towering frame and the quiet authority he exuded seemed to unsettle Whitman, who instinctively took a step back, as if unsure how to handle the calm figure before him. Turn around and face the vehicle, Whitman barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Keep your hands where I can see them. Anthony didn't hesitate, calmly resting his hands on the cool metal of the SUV's roof. The solid, unyielding surface beneath his palms was a reminder, one he had long since learned, that situations like this could escalate in the blink of an eye. His posture remained relaxed, almost effortless, though his mind was anything but. He knew the officer was searching for something, anything, to justify the rising tension that hung between them. Whitman moved in close, his hand stiff as he began a perfunctory pat-down. The motions were robotic, mechanical, as though he was going through the motions without really believing the man before him could pose a threat. His eyes narrowed as he spoke, voice dripping with skepticism. You said you're in law enforcement? Whitman's words hung in the air, taunting. Got any proof of that? Anthony tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining unreadable. In my wallet, officer, he replied, his tone even. The badge is in the inner pocket. For a brief, taut moment, Whitman hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes before he took a step back. Take it out slowly. Without a word, Anthony reached for his wallet, moving with deliberate care. His fingers brushed the leather, retrieving the badge in a fluid motion. He held it up for Whitman to see. Captain Anthony Dean, Downtown Precinct, he stated calmly, his gaze meeting the officer's for a heartbeat. Whitman froze, his body stiffening in shock. His eyes widened, his face betraying disbelief, though it wasn't just embarrassment that flushed his cheeks, it was something darker, a defensive, almost combative look. Captain, he finally muttered, his voice strained. If that's true, why didn't you say so from the start? Anthony's hands lowered, but his expression remained firm, unwavering. Because I shouldn't have to, he replied, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Respect shouldn't depend on my rank. The words hit harder than Whitman was prepared for, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken weight. Whitman's posture sagged ever so slightly, his authority evaporating. The silence stretched long and heavy, filling the empty space between them. Anthony met Whitman's gaze with quiet intensity. His eyes didn't waver, but there was something deeper there, a hint of disappointment or maybe a resigned understanding. Whitman, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, as if the truth was becoming too much to bear. He glanced down at the badge in Anthony's hand, chewing on the situation, but the taste was sour in his mouth. Well, Captain, Whitman finally said, his voice tinged with irritation, you can understand why I had to be thorough. Anthony's head tilted slightly to the side, studying the officer with quiet scrutiny. "Thorough is one thing," he replied, his voice calm, but a hard edge in his words. "Targeted is another." The words hung in the air, slicing through the pretense. Whitman flinched, his body stiffening. But he quickly recovered, masking his discomfort with a glare that held no conviction. "I don't know what you're implying," Whitman muttered, his voice faltering, "but I was just doing my job." Anthony folded his arms across his chest, his presence imposing without a word. "Let me ask you something, Officer Whitman," he said, his voice measured but carrying an undeniable weight. "What exactly did you see when you pulled me over? Was it a traffic violation, or something else?" Whitman's eyes darted away for a split second before snapping back, his words tumbling out faster now. "You ran a stop sign," he said, his tone sharpening, trying to seize control of the conversation once more. "That's a legitimate reason to pull someone over." "True," Anthony acknowledged, nodding slightly. "But the way you've handled this stop, the tone, the questions, the pat-down, does that feel legitimate to you?" The question landed like a punch, and Whitman looked away again, shifting uncomfortably. His fingers twitched around his flashlight, but his grip seemed tenuous now. "I was following procedure," he muttered, though the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. Anthony didn't step back. Instead, he moved closer, commanding, but calm. His presence alone demanded attention, a quiet authority that didn't need to shout. "Here's the thing about procedure," he began, his voice deliberate. "It's only as good as the intentions behind it. And tonight, your intentions were clear the moment you approached my window." Whitman opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but found no words. He stood there, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, the weight of his own actions beginning to settle in. Anthony wasn't finished yet. He stepped forward, his words now cutting through the officer's defenses with precision. "Whitman," Anthony's voice remained steady, but there was a deep weight behind every word. "I've been on this force long enough to recognize when a stop is about more than just a stop. You didn't see a law-abiding citizen tonight. You saw a man you assumed didn't belong behind the wheel of this vehicle." Whitman's lips pressed tight, his silence more telling than any words could be. The discomfort was palpable. His face flushed under the streetlights, but now it was a mixture of frustration and shame. Anthony didn't relent. His voice sharpened just a touch, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "You know what makes this harder? It's not the assumption. It's the fact that you felt entitled to act on it. You patted me down without cause, questioned my integrity without evidence. And now, when faced with the truth, you can't even own up to it." Whitman's body seemed to shrink under the force of the words. His earlier bravado had all but evaporated, replaced by a quiet shame he couldn't hide. He struggled to speak, his voice faltering. "Look, Captain," he began, his tone unraveling. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Anthony interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through the officer's excuses. "That's the problem, Whitman. You don't think beyond the moment. What happens if I wasn't who I am? What if I didn't have a badge to protect me? What if this interaction ended differently? Would you have been able to justify your actions then?" The question hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Whitman's face tightened, his grip on the flashlight white-knuckled, as though it might anchor him in the mounting realization of what he had nearly done. Anthony took a step back, his presence still commanding but his posture now more measured. "This isn't just about you or me," he said, his voice firm. "It's about what you represent when you wear that uniform. Every choice you make reflects on all of us. And tonight, you let your biases dictate those choices." Whitman's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Anthony's words pressing down like a burden. But Anthony wasn't done yet. He gestured toward the patrol car, his voice still firm. "Go ahead," he said. "Run the data again if you need to. Take your time. But when you come back, ask yourself this: are you serving the community, or are you serving your own assumptions?" Whitman hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Slowly, he turned away, his feet dragging as he made his way back to the patrol car. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, the tension almost palpable. But beneath it all, there was something else, something faint, yet unmistakable. A flicker of accountability, a crack in the armor of defiance. Whitman's steps were slow, almost reluctant, as if he knew this moment would follow him, lingering in his mind. But Anthony wasn't done. The night was far from over. As Whitman settled into his patrol car, staring blankly at the screen in front of him, Anthony leaned against his SUV, arms crossed, gaze unwavering. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, but Anthony understood, sometimes, growth doesn't happen in the heat of confrontation. It happens in the quiet aftermath. Inside the patrol car, Whitman's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he wasn't running any new checks. His eyes were fixed on the name on the screen, Captain Anthony Dean. The words seemed to burn into his mind, reminding him of the mistake he had made. His thoughts spiraled, replaying every decision, every assumption, each one more damning than the last. He thought about the oath he had sworn to protect, to serve with fairness, and to treat all citizens equally. But somewhere along the way, those principles had been clouded by assumptions he hadn't questioned. Tonight, they had led him to a crossroads, a moment he couldn't justify. After what felt like an eternity, Whitman opened the door of the patrol car and approached Anthony once again. His flashlight was off this time. His movements were slower, more tentative. "Captain Dean," he began, his voice quieter, the bravado stripped away. "I need to apologize." Anthony looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't make it easy for Whitman. "For what, exactly?" he asked, his tone even but firm. Whitman swallowed, his gaze faltering for a moment before locking eyes with Anthony. "For profiling you," he confessed, his voice almost inaudible. "For assuming things about you that had nothing to do with the situation." He looked down, then back up. "For treating you with less respect than I would have given someone else. I let my biases take over. It wasn't right." Anthony regarded him for a moment, weighing his words. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step, Whitman," he said, his voice calm but edged with resolve. "But apologies mean nothing if they don't lead to change. The question is, what are you going to do differently?" Whitman hesitated, his words stumbling as he struggled to find a response. But Anthony didn't wait for an answer. "Think about it," he said, his voice steady, yet commanding. "This uniform gives us power, but it also gives us responsibility. If you can't handle that, you shouldn't be wearing it." Whitman nodded slowly, the weight of Anthony's words settling over him. "I'll do better," he said quietly, though the promise sounded more like a plea, a silent vow to himself more than anyone else. Anthony's gaze never wavered. He knew that action spoke louder than words. Whitman returned to his car, the apology echoing in his mind like a lingering question he couldn't escape. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension. The silence of the night outside mirrored the turmoil brewing inside him. This wasn't just another shift. It was a reckoning. From a distance, Anthony watched him, his expression softened but still resolute. He didn't take satisfaction in what had transpired, but he understood the gravity of confronting these moments head-on. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Whitman finally started the engine, the low hum of the patrol car signaling the end of the stop. He pulled away slowly, offering a brief nod to Anthony as he passed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the patrol car disappeared into the night, Anthony climbed into his own vehicle, the familiar feel of the leather seat offering little comfort. His mind was far from at ease. He sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. Then, pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts. He landed on a name. Chief Harris. After a brief hesitation, he pressed dial. "Dean," came the chief's voice, groggy but alert. "What's going on?" Anthony leaned back against the seat, a sigh escaping him. "Chief, we need to talk about some of the training protocols and the culture on the force. Tonight wasn't an isolated incident." There was a pause on the other end before the chief responded. "I'll clear my morning. Come in early." "Thanks," Anthony replied, hanging up the call. He put the phone down and stared out the window, the empty street stretching out in front of him. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but tonight had marked a step in the right direction. A crack in the armor of complacency that allowed biases to thrive. But Anthony wasn't done yet. Tomorrow would bring a new challenge, the challenge of addressing the larger system that had allowed moments like this to persist. The next morning, Anthony walked into the precinct with purpose. His stride was steady, his expression unwavering. He wasn't here to blame or point fingers. He was here to start a conversation that couldn't wait any longer. Chief Harris was already in his office, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Morning, Dean," he said, gesturing for Anthony to sit. "You sounded serious last night." "I was," Anthony replied, sitting across from him. Something happened on my way home that I can't ignore. One of our officers pulled me over. It wasn't the stop itself. It was how he handled it. The chief's brow furrowed. Who was it? Whitman, Anthony said. But this isn't just about him. This is about the culture we've allowed to grow here, a culture where assumptions guide actions, where respect is conditional, and where accountability feels optional. The chief's expression darkened. Go on. Anthony recounted the events of the previous night in detail, not sparing any part of the interaction. He spoke not just about the stop, but about the deeper issues it revealed. Whitman apologized, he concluded, but an apology isn't enough. We need systemic changes, starting with how we train, how we hold each other accountable, and how we approach our role in the community. The chief nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. You're right, he said finally. I've been hearing murmurs about these issues, but hearing it from you makes it clear. What do you suggest? The chief asked. Mandatory bias training, Anthony answered without hesitation. Real training. Not a one-time session. And we need to make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated, whether from rookies or veterans. Our job is to serve and protect, not to intimidate and assume. The chief tapped his fingers on the desk, considering the words. It's not going to be easy, he said. You know how resistant some of the guys will be. I know, Anthony replied, his voice steady. But we don't have a choice. If we don't fix this, we'll lose the trust of the people we swore to protect. And we'll lose good officers who want to make a difference. The chief leaned forward, elbows on the desk. You're right. Let's start drafting a plan. I'll need your help to lead this. Anthony gave a small smile, the first one since the night before. I'm in, he said. Let's make it happen. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the real challenge lay ahead. The real work wasn't in the meeting rooms, it was in ensuring that the lessons learned would resonate far beyond the precinct walls.